Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Manitoba Agriculture Crop Talk webinar series. If you have any questions today during the presentation, please type them into the question section of the GoToWebinar menu, and we will answer them at the end of the presentations. This webinar is being recorded, and you will receive a link to the recording. Thank you.
Thanks, Laurie. I'd like to welcome everybody to the September 28th edition of CropTalk. And this week we are going to be talking, I guess we're getting into the season where a lot of soil sampling is going to be starting, or in some cases I think it's maybe already started. So I thought it'd be a good opportunity to get John Hurt to come on and talk about a little bit about soil sampling, I guess what he's been seeing this fall, and then a little bit on nutrient planning for next year. Been talking to a few producers, and one of their concerns is this fall and next year's crop could be one of the more expensive crops they've planted in years because of the price of everything. So I thought it would be good to talk a little bit about nutrient planning as well. From there, we'll go into our crop scouting panel, and there's been a few questions that have come up over the past few days here that I think would be good to address. So we'll get them answered during the crop scouting panel. I guess just to start off, a couple slides as to where we are right now in harvest. And when you look at our overall harvest, we're about 47% complete. Which is a fair bit below what our normal average would be. I think over the last couple days, a lot of producers have gotten into the field. Again, I think probably Sunday afternoon, I seen guys starting to go already, and then yesterday and the day before yesterday, I've seen quite a few combines going. So I think with the forecast we're having, that percentage is going to change quite a bit before the end of next week when our new crop report comes out. So good news there on the harvesting front. The other thing I've been seeing is quality has been holding on, which is good. So I think a lot of producers are happy to see that the rain that we got over the past week and a half hasn't changed quality too much. So as long as we can get some nice weather, I think the crop will still come in good condition. Again, just a few brief things of what's happened over the past week. We did have some poor harvesting weather, and producers have got into the field. I mentioned that. Most of the winter cereals are planted now and have benefited from the rains that we've gotten over the past week or so. And we've got moist conditions, and those crops are starting to emerge. There's still some producers that are going to be looking at planting winter wheat and fall rye, so I think they'll be going into well-established seed beds, so that's good as well. The other thing I've noticed is there's been a lot of swathing done over the last week or so, and I think producers are trying to bring in the crop and try to get it dried down quicker. A lot of that crop that's been being swathed has been desiccated, so it's just it's taking longer this year for those crops to dry down now. Whether it be maybe some of them got sprayed a little on the early side and we're still a little bit too green and seems to be taking longer, and just the lateness of the season where producers are starting to want to get the grain off and in the bin. So crop in the swath, this seems to I guess maybe have two advantages: maybe dry a little faster, and at night and evenings when our evenings aren't as long, maybe producers could harvest a little longer with the swath than trying to cut standing grain. Last couple days or last week or so, we've been touching the risk of frost. Not last night, the night before, we had frost in quite a few areas across the province. I thought this would be good to put up, kind of showing the areas which maybe got hit a little bit harder with frost, but we are in the area, the time period now of year where frost are going to become more and more of an issue. I think in the majority of the crop, we're going to be past the stage, and we've talked about this in the last couple of webinars where we all are kind of in the same boat where we think most of the crop is going to be okay. There are some producers that did plant some later cereals that might get affected by some frost, but again, nothing too critical. with that, just a few updates as to what's kind of been happening. I'm going to get John to come on now, and we're going to talk about soil sampling and nutrient planning. So Lori, if we could hand the screen over to John.
Okay, are we live?
You bet, John.
Lionel?
You bet, and the screen.
Okay. The screen is completely blank. It's like what my looked like out the window this morning and yesterday morning with frost. But yeah, I appreciate your promotion for my talk was a whole lot more artistic than mine here. Anyways, yeah, we've had some good cold mornings here, and it's time to be thinking about soil sampling if it's not already being done for you. Appreciate this opportunity and just want to run through some of the pointers. A lot of this will be review, but maybe two new things for you to consider in planning your soil sampling. I'm going to go light on nutrient planning because soil sampling has got to be done generally before nutrient planning starts. So I'll start into this. Some real simple things. Why to soil test? Some pointers on how to soil test. There are some early results in from AgVise, does summarize some of their early wheat results that they get in. I've had a question or two lately about post-crop credits for peas. And then in this mix, I'll show you where the soil temperatures are in Manitoba and how, if people are interested, they could track them to know, when are good times to soil sample, but also when are times to target for fall nitrogen application. First of all, Manitobans, we're kind of leading the pack versus our Western cousins when it comes to soil sampling. There are these surveys that have been done quite routinely for the last 5 years of farmers and sponsored by commodity associations and Fertilizer Canada, and getting their feedback on how they are managing different crops. One of the questions is, how often do you soil test for nitrogen and phosphorus and others? But here I put the nitrogen one, and showing that in Western Canada, about 30% of the farmers soil test for nitrogen every year on some of their fields. In Manitoba, it's 38%, more than some of the other provinces. So a pretty good portion of farmers are doing routine soil sampling, which is good. That those people don't need to be convinced by a government person sitting at their desk that soil sampling needs to be done. The other thing that notice there, it tends to be large farmers are doing more soil sampling. Small farmers under 2,000 acres are doing less than half as much sampling, which is maybe something I should be focusing more of our story on small farmers. The other thing, younger farmers, those under 40, are more likely to sample than old guys like me over 60. So the younger generation are more doing almost double the amount of sampling. And then the last set of bars below, those that are most familiar with the 4R program, that is efficient and responsible nutrient management using the 4 R's, which are the right source at the right rate, the right time, and the right place. All kind of encouraging statistics that we're seeing here. Again, to summarize, Manitoba generally doing more soil sampling than the other two provinces, tending to be large farms, tending to be younger farms, and farmers that are more tuned into the 4R principles. The other reasons, get this out of the way, why should we soil sample? I often say it's because of greed and self-interest is a driving factor in order to deal with high-priced inputs, which fertilizer still is, and in order to come up with appropriate recommendations so we can optimize returns for that crop. The other thing is it's the right thing to do environmentally right now. We've for several years been focused on phosphorus management. Now with global warming concerns, we're focused on nitrogen management. So doing soil sampling is kind of a responsible thing to do to make sure we're targeting the right amount of nutrients. And certainly some farmers, particularly those with manure, are required to do this under regulations. But really something that is a great thing, and most agronomists will be doing for farmers if they're on a program, is tracking the soil test levels over time and using it as a measure of how to track the crop performance, maybe past fertilization, and knowing over the long term if we're moving the nutrient status of that field in the right direction. And that's something that would be talking about in nutrient management planning. When can you afford to replenish soils, and when do you, in the short term, as a survival technique, do you put on less than the crop's going to remove, knowing full well that you're going to have to replenish that in the future. So these are just some fertilizer prices. Our colleagues in Alberta track these regularly through the season. These two graphs here, the one on the left is for anhydrous ammonia, the one on the right for urea, kind of mirror images with a few changes in there, and showing that the run-up in fertilizer prices that we experienced over the last year or so is still there. And I did talk to a retailer in some retailers the last couple of days, and I stuck in the arrows where they were quoting me current prices. I'm surprised at the ammonia one, because other dealers told me that ammonia has gone up quite a bit this fall. And so maybe what's more realistic is the urea chart there, that there were some slightly lower prices over the summer, but in the last month or so, those fertilizer prices have increased and tended to make things a little quiet at the ag retailer office these days, because farmers are seeing that the prices are moving up again. That's the nitrogen scene. Phosphate, again, some of the same, maybe some price slackening during the summer, but my most recent quote was for about $13.50 a ton. So it means that phosphorus prices are still high and needs to be managed for optimum efficiency, and that may mean some different strategies depending on how much income the grower has. Now, I guess that's the other thing. I can't just talk about high fertilizer prices. Farmers with good crops have some high prices they're receiving for those crops, and it may well be that they can still purchase the same number of pounds of fertilizer with a bushel of crop as before. So the two, it's not coincidentally that they go hand in hand. So we've got some of the rules of soil sampling here. And the first one that usually comes up is, when should I soil sample? And is there a problem with early soil sampling? Traditionally, when we used to have these guidelines, we used to say, wait till it's 5 or 10 degrees C before we sample, because by that time, mineralization or changes in the soil have slowed down and levels are rather static for nitrogen. And so we've tended to say that, or in the spring, is the best time to soil sample, close to when the crop is going to use it. But I've listed here some of the pros and cons about doing earlier soil sampling. The pros are that if we sample before tillage is done on that field, we get better cores, better separation, a better picture of our 0 to 6 and 6 to 24-inch sample. We can still see and spot problem areas and avoid them for our composite sample, or target them for diagnostic sampling. There's better availability of custom soil sample people and services if we're going early. And a big thing is, it gives us time to make fall fertility decisions, either for applications or purchasing of fertilizer. So some real strong pros there. The cons are, the flip side is, well, nitrate nitrogen can change if we have warm, moist soils. And so we can see some accumulation of nitrate nitrogen in a warm soil. More recent studies have been done, have looked at this, and I said, yes, but with cereals, that tends to be fairly slight. And so if you're going to be doing early soil sampling, really we can do that after cereals without a lot of change to the nitrogen. Change or accumulation of nitrogen more likely after an oilseed or pulse crop. And there's potential losses or hiding of nitrogen if we get excessive regrowth in the fall of volunteer, or if, as we experienced last year after soil sampling, we had excessive, not rainfall in the fall, but I'd say snow melt and moist soils in the spring, and some leaching that caused losses. So those are the compromises we make. And generally the compromise of the big one is just get the soil sampling done when you can. If it appears that there have been some losses or changes, those are things that some strategic sampling later in the spring may be able to help you take into account. Just a peek at what current soil temperatures are. This is for your area, Lionel, the Southwest. And maybe the most important thing here is that website on the bottom, or you can Google Manitoba agriculture weather and then go to soil temperatures. And it will show at our weather stations out there what the soil temperatures are at 2-inch depths. And actually shows us we're getting fairly close there to our target of about 10 degrees C. 10 degrees C is where we would think that fall fertilization could be considered. Usually we hone in on that right around Thanksgiving time. So if folks are interested, they can track their regional soil temperatures using this resource here. Other things on rules for soil sampling. We in Manitoba, our depths that we recommend are 0 to 6 inches and 6 to 24 inches. And the target for those is based on the nutrient mobility. Nutrients that are mobile in water and taken up through water flow, like nitrogen, sulfur, chloride, those should be sampled on the 0 to 6 and the 6 to 24 inch sample. But nutrients that are immobile, such as phosphorus, potassium, many of our micronutrients, organic matter, pH, those are analyzed on the 0 to 6 inch sample. So generally for custom soil samplers out there, they'll be doing this one of two ways. They'll be pulling a 2-foot core and splitting that core, or occasionally what they will do instead is that they will take a full 2-foot core, submit that, and then a 0 to 6 inch core that will be for the immobile nutrients. Either way, they'll be capturing the soil in order to get those amounts. Now, as we move further west, they tend to compromise on this depth. They sometimes go with a 0 to 12 inch sample. I see that just kind of a bad compromise both ends. It means your immobile nutrients are kind of diluted. They often include some high pH subsoil, which limits their availability. And again, 0 to 12 inches is inadequate for nitrogen estimates. So they tend to use a conversion factor. And that conversion factor, its appropriateness can vary based on the type of moisture you've had that year. So since we have a very good fleet of custom soil sampling people, either through ag retailers or independent consultants, we'd say find a consultant or a soil tester that'll do the 2-foot sampling for you. The number of samples, if you're just using a single sample submission for that field, generally a field composite with 15 to 20 pokes is generally adequate to characterize that field. Many more people now are doing some measure of zone soil sampling, and that would mean dividing the field up into 3 to maybe 5 or 7 different management zones. And when you're doing those zones are areas that would be managed or fertilized similarly, in that case you take 8 to 10 pokes per zone. And again, sample problem areas separately. We used to say don't sample problem areas, just keep it out of our composite, but now it probably warrants sampling them separately to find out what's going on in that area, particularly if it may be salinity related. More on the zone sampling, and this is some guidelines from North Dakota. They say, they recommend developing zones using at least 2 tools to delineate your zones. So those could be aerial or satellite images of crop canopy, soil electrical conductivity with, for example, Veris machine or EM38, multi-year yield maps, topography, etc. Just recommending, use whatever resources that you may have access to there to help you to delineate zones that will perform similarly, and then soil sampling them separately and fertilizing separately if warranted. Simple rules of sampling is to avoid contamination or tainting of the sample that you've taken. So use plastic, not metal pails. There's zinc and galvanized pails, and we want to avoid that. Use an inert lubricant, and this is usually pretty critical on heavy clay soils, particularly if they get wet. WD-40 is kind of the standard. In the past, we've done some comparisons. Sometimes we run into a problem with vegetable oils. And the problem seems to be is that vegetable oil is kind of like a substrate. If we use vegetable oil and the microbes are chugging away there in a moist sample, they can either take the nitrogen numbers up or they could take the nitrogen numbers down. So avoid your vegetable oils. If you're sampling for chloride, rubber gloves are good to use so you don't, because of course soil samplers are hardworking people and they're sweating out there. You don't want to include that in your sample. And then as long as soils are moist and warm, nitrogen transformations can continue in that sample. So recommendations are to air dry if you can't get samples sent in right away. But mostly now people are just keeping those samples cool and getting them shipped right away to the lab. And that seems to be performing pretty well. I'm going to talk a little more here about some projects that we've done recently to show where we could go wrong. And that is we really want to avoid sampling fertilizer bans. And that includes the fresh band or last year's application or rather the application this spring. So and most samplers would know that this guy has a seed hawk unit, so he's got a band of fresh fertilizer an inch or two to the side of the row, so let's not sample there. But we also sometimes need to consider legacy bands of fertilizer, and that's where there's not a lot of tillage done, and we can see these legacy band areas built up to high levels and could taint an uninformed sampler. So let's look at 2 examples. One here is looking at strip till, and under strip till tillage system, the bulk of the fertilizer is applied strategically for the crop's access in that tilled strip. And so that stripped area may be enriched in nutrients much more than the undisturbed area between the strips. And we've done some soil sampling. This next slide shows that the the amount of nitrogen and phosphorus in the row is quite a bit more than the between row soil samples. So what's the true measure for that field? How should a farmer be soil sampling that? Well, based on work out of the States where they do a lot more than this, you'd use a sampling ratio of 1 to 3. So for every poke you took in the row, you would take 3 in the between row areas to provide a good estimate of the field soil fertility. Random rover sampling the bands, it could give you variable soil test results, or maybe even inflate results. But that's especially if the strips are in the same place each year. This particular grower that we sampled with, he rotates with narrow seeded crops, such as wheat or canola, and alternates the strip positions. Where his strip is one year, it'll be on the previous row or in the other between area next year. So in such case, this is not such a serious problem that long-term concentration in the same spot is not expected. But if they were in a true strip till system where they stayed in the same strip every year and did not deviate from that, we'd expect to see this variability imparted in the field. Another example here is with legacy bands where more typical prairie crops are being used, wheat or canola, seeded in narrow rows, and where high rates of phosphorus or potassium are banded and not disturbed by tillage. And this is with a grower just north of Brandon where we did some sampling. And he had been doing some work at building soils, phosphorus levels by banding in some high rates of phosphorus. In my slide to the right there, you can see the little blue canola seed, and then to the side and below where the fertilizer would typically be banded or placed. This next slide just shows some sampling that I did 3 years after some applications of either a standard fertilizer rate, the medium, or the high rate in order to build phosphorus levels. You can see with standard rates that are being used, and those are basically maintenance rates each year, there was not a lot of difference between whether I sampled on that 3-year-old band or to the side or below or between. So lower soil test levels or where maintenance rates are being applied, not a big deal. But where the medium and high rates of phosphorus had been applied, that band or close to band area had much higher levels. Researchers have kind of figured this out, and we evaluated this here. They have a little formula, and it's just that the way it worked here is that with 30 centimeter or 12-inch wide rows, you divide the row width by 30 centimeters or 12 inches and multiply by 8. That tells you how many pokes to take outside the band for every poke you would take in the band. Now, as a summary of this, what the typical soil sampler is doing, if band applications are known, they can either avoid the band and still get some pretty good values, or if they're going to include the band, use one of these sampling strategies I just talked about. If the band locations are not known, particularly if these are old bands that were put on, then just make sure that you're taking lots of pokes in that field. More pokes will tend to dilute any inflated values. And when I mentioned band here, it includes the side band here, but also if people are putting high or build rates in mid-row bands, in that case, then the mid-row band would be a place you would probably wish to avoid in your fall sampling. The other thing, as far as band, or not bands, but variability that may occur in the field, that, and this is just a suggestion, that occasionally a grower may want to take, in addition to the others, a 0 to 2 inch sampling. Two reasons for this. One, and generally caused in both cases by under reduced till or zero till with surface or near surface fertilizer application, we can see some of the following happening. First, with repeated nitrogen applications can acidify the soil, and that's just the natural process that happens during the nitrification conversion of ammonium fertilizer to nitrate. And over the long term, it will tend to reduce soil pH, becoming a big problem in Montana, some areas of North Dakota. We're hoping to have a speaker at the agronomist conference on this. And occasionally we do see aluminum toxicity in crops such as canola resulting from this. So again, if you've got some problems showing up in the field, maybe some of that shallow sampling to point that out. The other thing, and this is more of an environmental, in fact, some of the environmental folks have suggested this, that this should just be routine, that people should be sampling that shallow in order to know what the phosphorus level is, because it's that surface phosphorus that's more vulnerable to runoff into the water. And typically that value is about 2 times the 0 to 6 inch level. Okay, so what are the early reports from soil sampling this year? And this is compliments of AgVise. When they run their first 10,000 samples through the lab from the Northern Great Plains, they do a bit of a summary. The summary is pretty simple here. Looks like across much of Manitoba, the bulk of the samples are testing in the very low to low categories. And that is basically informing growers that for next year's crop, a healthy or high rate of nitrogen may be required, except for those instances where the levels are higher. Don Flayton was always a fan of using this fall soil test as an auditing tool, and in some of his final research he did with wheat and corn, didn't establish, but kind of confirmed these general thumb rules. That is, if you've got less than 20 pounds residual N, then sometimes that might mean that there is insufficient nitrogen for full yield potential. If there's a 20 to 50 pound level of nitrogen remaining, means generally good job of meeting the nitrogen supply, meeting the demand of the plant. And if you have more than 50 to 55, then more nitrogen was supplied than what was needed for that resulting yield potential. So you may want to just consider those little thumb rules when you're reviewing your soil test results. Far cry from last year. Last year, this time, we were looking at these levels, and we can see that with a drought, widespread drought last year, that we had many samples testing more than 100 pounds of nitrogen, and probably very few in that very low category. So far cry from last year's high carryover levels. So where did the nitrogen go? Well, I'm expecting that farmers backed off or reduced nitrogen rates this year based on their soil testing done in the fall. Second one is, I've heard of some very good wheat yields being harvested, and so undoubtedly we've had a fair bit of removal. But the other thing we can't forget is what happened last spring and summer. We had a very wet spring, and with the high nitrate carryover, nitrogen is vulnerable to leaching. And what we measured were leaching losses. We had a project where we sampled about a dozen clay or clay loam fields and noticed that nitrogen levels dropped about 30 pounds or 18% in those fields. And leaching isn't generally a big thing on clay soil, so that was quite a bit. On 2 or 3 sandy soils that we measured, we noticed about 65 pounds of nitrogen move out of the rooting zone. This last 2 weeks, I've been doing a bunch of scouting and harvesting in cornfields, and on any sandy fields I've been to, I'm seeing nitrogen deficiencies, firing the bottom leaves right up to the cob. So that's telling me on those sandy fields, not only did we have losses, but farmers probably did not account for those losses with sufficient nitrogen applications. Again, just an artifact of that high rainfall being received or water moving through the soil profile when nitrogen is in the nitrate form. What about nitrogen contribution from peas? Generally with peas, mineralization occurs 4 to 5 weeks after harvest, meaning that nitrogen that the peas are going to give you will show up in the soil test. Not sure if that's the case this year. Our harvest was later, and some people are doing early soil sampling, probably before full mineralization kicks in. So they're questioning, should I use credits? The general credit that we have in our soil fertility guide is about 25 pounds of nitrogen for peas. But let me show you or scare you with some of the data. This is some of the research that was based upon 4 experiments that were done. And if we look at the peas here, we can see the amount of nitrogen available to next year's wheat crop based on per 15 bushels of seed produced. So for peas, it contributed about 10, 10, 0, and 12 pounds of nitrogen per bushel of seed produced. And so for agronomist I was talking to that had a 60 bushel crop, that would equate to about a 40 pound credit, but there's variability based on the weather and other circumstances. We did, I did a bunch of sampling a couple years ago in a very dry fall. Because it was so dry, I noticed no increase in nitrogen throughout the fall because there was essentially no mineralization taking place. But with spring sampling, we started to see some of that nitrogen picking up. One thing noted, though, is that at the one site in Notre Dame, really good yields, but really uneven spread of crop residue. We had more nitrogen show up, but in those areas. And because it was poorly spread residue, and that, if anything, might cause dripping within the field. So a real heads up to people that are combining, try to spread that residue as much as possible if you're going to be looking at it for its nitrogen contribution. So a summary, soil testing is just essential for informed fertilization decisions. There's a number of good practices. Not many farmers do their own sampling, so their onus is make sure your custom soil sampler does the right things, follows good practices. And I guess for growers, just be prepared for high fertilizer bills because there's reduced nitrogen carryover than last year, and fertilizer costs are still high. So if you're harvesting some good yields and have marketed them at some good prices, that's where some of those returns will be going. Lionel, that's my last slide. If anyone's got any questions that they're looking for.
Yeah, sure. There's a few questions and a couple of comments that have come in, but so first of all, when you were talking about the pH and you're talking about taking the soil sample at a shallower base, somebody commented here, it's a problem here in Manitoba with 0 to 6 inches, pH is of 4.2.
Ouch. Ouch. Yes. Okay. Well, in those cases, like when they get to 5 or below, we would expect to be seeing, generally it's aluminum or manganese toxicity shows up in the crop, poor nodulation in things. So yes, if you're seeing pHs like that, some aggressive surgery is required, and that would be liming with some type of materials. We generally, in Manitoba, what little liming is done with byproducts such as lime mud from water treatment plants, or in northern Manitoba, we can access wood ash, which is an excellent but kind of onerous to apply liming agent. We have lots of limestone quarries in Manitoba, but they just do not grind lime to the fineness to be needed for liming. And there are some other strategies that you could do in the short term until you bite the bullet and use lime. And those will hopefully be discussed at the agronomist conference in December.
Okay.
Herbicide carryover is bad. Those pHs or pursuit and odysseys will persist and cause more issues for the following crops. So yeah, pHs in that range are just bad news.
Okay, and an additional comment was made is they've been liming for 15 years. So would that be the type of lime they're using?
Well, I'm not going to say they've been liming for 15 years. They'll continue liming for their lifetime. My previous experiences with liming in Ontario, and their liming is sometimes an application of 3 to 5 tons of lime every 5 or 8 years. And you're just going to bite the bullet and get used to it. I can't sugarcoat this, that liming is a practice that we're just going to have to get used to on those type of soil pHs. Now, the other factor that I need to remind you is that some soil test companies do the pH on the 6 to 24-inch sample. The reason for that is research out of Iowa shows that if we have high pH or calcareous soil below the level, then the response to lime is not that high, and it may buffer the response or how serious the problem is. So that would be a good value to have. But if levels are in the 4s, it is probably still something that warrants some application remediation. With that, we recommend tillage to incorporate it. Leaving lime at the very surface is not such a great thing.
Okay. David Kaminsky would like to make a comment regarding, I think it's regarding disease, but David, if you wanted to make that comment now.
We're not hearing you, David.
Hey, Dave, you can come next door and shout in my computer. Okay. Another comment that came in, John, was a water treatment lime works really well, corrects the issue quick, and then small rates to maintain.
Lionel, can I just throw in about that acidic soil question? I'm sorry, we're doing it the old-fashioned way. Me and John, we're figuring things out. I hate to layer on, but another thing to consider with acid soils, if that's truly the case, is a heightened risk of clubroot infection when you're growing canola. Acid soils are conducive to more symptoms if the pathogen is there in the soil. We've seen some very serious infections in peat soils, which generally have a lower pH, or acid soils. So just one more thing to consider. And in fields where clubroot exists already, liming has been used as a technique for kind of spot treatment to try and lower the pH where it's low. Or, sorry, increase the pH where it's low.
Okay, good. Thanks for those comments, David.
So I missed that line, but I think the comment was about using the water treatment lime mud. And yeah, I think that's good, but needs to continue to be monitored, because as long as we continue using modern production practices and using nitrogen fertilizer or sulfur fertilizers, soil acidification is a natural process also. So pH will always decline. In Manitoba, most of our soils have high pH. It'll never decline very much in our lifetime, But in certain cases where there isn't a lot of high lime in there, growers with we'll be seeing more, and that's why we're suggesting that people kind of monitor for it if they're suspecting it.
Okay, John, there's just one more question that came in here, and it's a little bit different from what we've been talking, but wants to know, or wants you to comment regarding sulfur fines and their value.
Okay, yes, they are, the sulfur fines are basically the same analysis as the granular products, so something like 210024. And they can work fine providing they're broadcast applied and get an even pattern. I know several years ago, I don't know if it was you, Lionel, or Elmer, up your area, we saw strange patterns in the field, and that's because you're putting on such a big volume, generally, maybe 500 pounds of product, that whether the applicator was going up the hill or down the hill, it varied the spread pattern. And so I'd say put a piece of 2x4 under the gas pedal so the guy can't go too fast, so he gets good spread patterns, and then it may be reliable for supplying your nitrogen. The other thing is be careful if you're spreading it and you have eroded knolls. If we put ammonium sulfate on eroded knolls high in pH, we can experience volatilization losses of that nitrogen. The sulfur is not affected, but nitrogen losses can occur. So if you're doing that, then tillage would be required in order to prevent that nitrogen loss.
Okay, thanks, John. That was once again a great presentation regarding soil testing and nutrient management, and we had some good questions come from it. So thanks again for doing that. And now what we'll do is we're going to go into our crop scouting panel, and a few questions have come in this week. One of the first ones that I've been getting the last couple of days is looking at desiccating sunflowers and what should I look for. And I'm not sure if Dane is on, Lori.
I can't see him, so I don't believe so, no.
Okay, well, I'll take a stab at this. There's some pretty good pictures I've got shown in the bottom here, and basically what you're looking for is the picture on the right-hand side where you see the bracts starting to turn color, and the back of the head starting to get a brownish to yellowish kind of look to it, and that'll give you an opportunity to where it's time where you won't get any damage to the seed. And what you're looking for is that 30 to 35% moisture. So one way you can do this is you can do the microwave test, which would be to grab a head and to take out some sunflower seed and run it through the microwave and just see where it stops going down for moisture-wise, and you'll determine the moisture in the head. Best thing for that is to go to the website from the National Sunflower Association, and they'll have the information on that site as to how to do that test. And Kirk is on, and I wanted to get her to comment about the next couple slides. Anne, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here. Can you hear me?
You bet.
Okay, great. Sure. So we've been talking a bit about winter cereal seeding, which is wrapping up now. So the variety market share report, which Lionel has this slide up here showing the percentage of different varieties planted. So as has been for the last quite a few years, Emerson was the most popular variety planted in the fall of 2021, followed by AAC Wildfire. So AAC Wildfire is a newer variety. In terms of yield, it's a very well-yielding variety with moderate resistance to fusarium, so it has become a popular variety. One notable thing with the seeded acreage report was that in 2021, farmers reported seeding about 52,000 acres of winter wheat. and that's up about 15,000 acres in the previous year. So we did see a big jump in winter cereals being seeded this last year, partly maybe because of favorable fall conditions. Perhaps, you know, it had to do with new varieties being available, especially for fall rye. But I think people that did seed winter cereals last year were fairly pleased this spring when they didn't have to think about getting those crops in the ground. And I think, great, Lionel has a slide up here showing the comparisons from Seed Manitoba from last year for the winter cereal varieties. So in terms of yield, as I mentioned, Wildfire averaged across locations and years has been the highest yielding variety with fairly good disease resistance and very good winter hardiness. So it is a good choice for farmers. Yeah, so when we don't have the winter cereal data out from the McVet trials from this summer due to some data issues, but they will be out with Seed Manitoba in November. So you can get a look at the newer varieties and see what's available at that time.
Okay, thanks, Anne. I think we do have time for Kim to maybe talk a little bit about this. We're seeing some cooler temperatures, and we're starting to get into fall weed control. So maybe Kim, if you're ready, we'll go through a couple of your slides here regarding fall weed control after frost.
Sure, thanks, Lionel. So yeah, we've had a frost now for the last couple of nights, I think, depending on the area. You know, it's been a fairly decent frost. And so, of course, we always are wondering, you know, what are we going to do after, after a frost, and when do we do that? So, of course, our usual suspects, you know, we've got kochia, you know, we've got our foxtail barley. We've also got like our pigweeds and our lamb's quarters sticking up above the crops. And so any crop that wasn't desiccated, if these weeds were there, they may be regrowing after harvest. I know we do have a late harvest now, later than normal. So of course we're not getting a chance to get some of these, to get a lot of regrowth on these plants afterwards. But you know, these are the things that we're looking at in the fields right now. But the usual suspects for fall weed control, like our perennials, like our thistles, our dandelions, our quack, you know, those are lots of times if we can get those with a good pre-harvest, or you know, some of our fall weed control, our pre-harvest weed control sprays do a good job on those. But you know, now we're looking at our winter annuals, we're looking at regrowth on some of those other weeds as well. But our winter annuals, as like our narrow-leaved hawksbeard, night-flying catchfly, our white cockle, cow cockle for some areas as well. Bladder campion for those, some people have that as well. That's in that same family. Our stinkweed, our cleavers. And then for annuals, I know I have a question mark here. You know, do you need to be spraying your annuals? You know, that depends. Can we stop them from setting seed before winter? We don't want to put that seed back in the soil. Are they taking up valuable nutrients? Are they taking up valuable moisture? The answer is usually yes to both of those questions. So again, you know, how are we going to control those annuals that are growing right now? And, you know, how do we go at that? So anyways, if we can have the next slide, when is the best time after to spray in the fall? Basically, you should allow regrowth after harvest. Again, I know we're having a really late harvest this year. We're really sitting at only about 50% across the board, but we do have a lot of cereal crops off, and some fields have been off for quite a while. So there's some pretty decent weed growth. You see some of these fields really greening up now that have been harvested for a few weeks now. So 4 to 6 weeks if possible. We're probably not going to get that this year, but as much regrowth as possible before you start to spray. But you do need green growing tissue, and I've got 4 leaves here with a question mark. Ideally as much as possible before we run out of calendar year here, and you know, it gets too cold. So we do want green growing tissue. Ideally any 4 leaves would be good, but if you start to spray perennials now, but you could wait a little longer for the winter annuals just to get all those that emerge, because there could still some of those be coming. We've had a bit of rain last week, You know, that slowed down our harvest, but I do think, you know, that'll probably speed up the weed growth. And we've got some really nice temperatures this week other than the cold nights. And so that's going to encourage some weed growth. So when we're looking at temperatures though for spraying, basically we want temperatures above 8 degrees for a few hours after application. So by mid-morning or early afternoon, if our temperatures are hitting 8 degrees, which again, we are having some really nice weather this week for sure, these are real ideal temperatures for spraying. Now, after a frost, you have to evaluate. Is the leaf tissue green and pliable? You really need to have 60% of that plant still alive, because that plant still has to take up the chemical, or, you know, you're just wasting your money. We don't need to be doing that. After any frost, you should be waiting 2 to 3 days to assess. So we had a frost the other night. We had another maybe light one last night, depending on the area, but most of us, I think, across the province did get that good frost on Monday night. And so, you know, we probably need to be looking to waiting until tomorrow or Friday before we resume spraying operations before, you know, like I said, we do have ideal weather for those weeds to rebound, but we don't want to be going in too soon after a frost. So if we can get to the next slide, and I think that's the last one I have, basically, depending on the products, but I would wait 3 days or longer before tillage. So if we do spray and then you do want to go in and do some tillage right after, like give that product time to get in there. If you're looking at anything with glyphosate in it, you want to get that into the root system. Any of the systemic products, you want to get them into the root system. So try to leave it a few days for sure before we start doing fall tillage. And with glyphosate, the low rates don't cut it if there's not a lot of leaf material. You can't be scrimping on rates if you're going to do that. There's a variety of tank mix products. That's another whole talk on that. We may be able to do that next week if Lionel has time. We can talk about the various products that we can use. But basically, and I'm always a fan of keeping the water volume up. I know you don't need to have a lot of water with glyphosate as long as you've got good water. Then 10 gallons, you get lots of coverage, especially if those weeds are a little smaller, if they've been cut off and they're regrowing, or we've got some of those winter annuals that are fairly small at this point. We do want to get good coverage. So even with systemic products, we still want good coverage. So lots of water, good water, and that'll give you the best success when you're spraying. And that's all I had. Thanks, Lionel.
Great, thank you, Kim. And yeah, that's something that I think maybe we will look at for next week, where we'll talk a little bit more about products and rates and a little bit more about timing. So thanks again for giving us a brief update. A couple slides I wanted to put up. I'm always getting questions about figuring out grain in a bin, so I'm not going to go into too much detail, but there's the formula for figuring out your bushels in when you're looking at the grain depth up to the cone. And then if you're dealing with the cone, the work for, or the formula for figuring that out as well. This also works for the hopper bottom. So if you got a hopper bottom bin, you'd want to do both sides to figure out the total amount in the bin. So that information usually comes up every year that producers are wanting to figure out how much are in the bins. The hay listing service, it's on and going, so definitely if you've got hay for sale or looking to buy hay, look into that website. Our crop residue burning is up and at it again, and so make sure you're checking the website to make sure whether it's a burning day or not a burning day, and there's the website there. We're getting close to October, so we're getting into the days here where we'll be having these pickup days for unwanted chemical and livestock medications. So if you're in any of these locations, you can mark the dates down. The crop production extension specialists in the province, there's I guess the 7 of us now, which is great to have. So just there's our names and contact information. Our livestock people that are getting fairly busy now as producers are starting to move cattle around and look at getting some feed off and looking at doing rations. So definitely make sure you contact them if you want information. Our MASC offices, our Ag Services offices, there are 1-800 numbers. So as we're getting harvest done and getting into more reporting time periods, you'll be probably needing to be talking to them. And if you have questions or ideas or things to us talk about during our crop talk, there's Lori Forbes and my information. And like to thank John on giving us the presentation today and our panel again for getting some of those questions answered for us. And join us next week. It'll be October the 5th for the next crop talk.